What's up everybody? Today I'm going to be going over my process for editing Milky Way photos. I'm going to cover how you stack your multiple exposures to reduce noise. We're going to be using programs like Lightroom, Photoshop, and a program called Sequator. That's what's used for stacking the photos. I'm going to go over how to deal with your foreground, whether you light painted your foreground or you took a blue hour shot, how to mask that into your final image, basically composites. We're going to cover 3 images, the stack, a couple examples of the foreground, and putting together a multiple image pano. I'm going to try to do at least 3 or 4 images depending on how long the editing takes. Usually Milky Way photography tends to be a little bit more labor intensive when it comes to the editing. So got a few examples right here, so let's go ahead, jump into Lightroom and get started. So for this tutorial, as mentioned, you're going to need a copy of Adobe Lightroom, Photoshop, and a free program called Sequator. You just Google Sequator, Sequator, and you'll find it and download it. It's a free program. Let's look at our images here. I'm going to show you all the images. I'm not sure if we're going to get to all of them, but just to have them here at the beginning of the video. So we have this is a shot from Ruby Beach over in Olympic State Park. The foreground in this image was light painted. It was a mix of this one and this one. As you can see, some of the rocks are further from me than the others, so it's a little bit uneven as far as the lighting. But I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 photos stacked for the background here. And this was on the first night of my trip, so I was just getting used to the settings. I believe I could have raised the ISO to make it a brighter image, but as you can see, they're kind of dark. I was just getting back into the astrophotography, but still worked out. Next over here, we have a single shot stack from Mount Rainier National Park. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. As I mentioned, you need at least 7 images. Between 7 and 10 is usually what you need. It'll stack and reduce noise in your sky. Over here you can see it's very low noise because of the stack, and then also in the foreground. And there's not really a foreground interest in this. The reflection serves as somewhat that Milky Way actually was in an odd direction. The Mount Rainier, the peak was somewhere over here, and it just wasn't going to line up, so I just took what I could get there. I should mention these previous shots, they were shot with the 14mm 2.8 Rokinon, which is my go-to wide angle for the astrophotography. This was actually shot with a 35mm 1.4 Sigma, and this is in Secret Beach, shot down by the water, by the shore. Single image, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This one was 8 images stacked together. No noise over here, looking pretty good. The 1.4, I believe it let me get down to about 4000 ISO and 10 seconds, so pretty good lens for astrophotography. Next here we have our pano taken from the same location. I believe it was up on the ridge, and this, I believe, was 12 images, 12 or 13 images taken. And you're gonna notice the noise is a little bit more present in this image, and this green stuff, by the way, that you've been seeing in all these photos, it is actually not noise. In certain areas of the US, I believe it's a coastline thing, but don't quote me on that, there's something called air glow, and it causes these green blotches. It's kind of annoying because it almost makes you seem like you took an amateur astrophotography shot, and that's just like color noise that messed up the shot. But it's something called air glow. You could do something with the HSL slider and desaturate it, change the colors, but I just leave it as is because it's too much work for what it's worth. But that is our pano shot that we might go over. We're definitely going to go cover this one. This is also from Secret Beach, taken up at the ridge with the Rokinon 14mm 2.8. Settings here were probably 8000, 10,000 ISO. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 photo stack for the Milky Way. And this was a blue hour composite. I stayed until the morning, shot this blue hour shot, and just had to align it and place it here. So it's basically a composite, but a true composite because it was actually at the location. There's people who composite Milky Way photos onto any old background, which I don't fully agree with, because sometimes it looks better than actual photos taken on location, and it sort of devalues the fact that you put whatever effort in to get it all in one shot if you're going to do composites to look better sometimes. But that's just my personal opinion. I could have done a little bit better over here. You could see the horizon line is a little too visible. We'll see if we can do something better this time around. But that's just a matter of having a softer fade in the mask. Lastly, we have another pano here. This was taken at Crater Lake. A lot more light pollution at this location. So you have all these blotches here. There's still air glow, so it has this greenish tinge. Like I said, not much you can do about that. These are the original. I believe there was a gap here because I might have touched the camera, or there was some kind of vibration in between. Usually you want an overlap of at least 30%. So I had to skip a couple of frames, but as you can see, it's still Photoshop, or Lightroom rather, put it together pretty well. A little bit more noise because these aren't stacked images, just like the previous example, but you just kind of work with what you got. So to begin, let's start with something easy. We're going to start with this image from Ruby Beach. So the first thing you want to do is get your brackets together, or your stacked shots over here. And you want to just pick one, and you don't actually want to do the profile lens correction because that'll sometimes mess up the stacking in Sequator. So you want to save that for afterwards. So we're going to start with our basic adjustments here. I would normally speed through this if it's kind of redundant, but for these first few, I'm going to show you step by step what I do here. So first thing is landscape. Adobe Landscape brings out the color. Want to increase the exposure a little bit. We're not going to worry too much about noise in the foreground because we have that foreground light painted shot. And as far as astrophotography white balance, it really is to taste, because some people I've seen prefer more of like a blue toned Milky Way. Some people like it a little bit more purple. I like a little bit of purple, less blue, more yellow, because the yellow kind of brings out the orangish of the core here. So you pretty much just make sure you have a calibrated monitor and just kind of tune it by hand here. And you don't have to worry about making sure this is completely yellow, because we're going to paint in the yellow a little bit more when we take it into Photoshop. So see what it looks like there. It's a lot darker image than you would normally work with because I was kind of amateurish with the settings, and you can see these satellite shooting star streaks, which are only present in some of the photos. And Sequator, a cool thing is Sequator does, it'll actually identify and remove those, so you don't have to worry about doing anything with the healing brush to get rid of them. But let's continue on here. Kind of even out the exposure. The vignetting we're going to deal with later, but might do a little bit of vignetting removal here just so we have a good start. And then clarity is also something that is to taste. Some people like these very clarity slidered, you know, contrasty, something like, this is an exaggerated version of it, but something like this where you can see every single little bit of detail. My personal style is a little bit more in the opposite direction. I do add contrast, but I actually reduce the clarity, and just kind of, I like the look overall. We're not going to worry too much about saturation because that'll come later, and we don't want to accentuate these air glow lines too much at the beginning. So that's good enough to start with. I'll do a tiny bit of noise reduction here, even though the stacking is going to take care of most of it. So for something like this, I would just maybe add like 5 luminance. Don't touch the sharpening at this point, and then do a little before and after, and that's looking good. So now we're going to select all of our stacked images here and sync all these settings. All right. These foreground shots we're going to deal with a little bit later once we have our stacked images set. And so the way the process works with Sequator is you take your stacked images, and it works best with TIFF files. So you want to export these, and you go into your settings. I have actually a preset here for my astro photography. So you're gonna just change them to TIFF, put them in a separate folder, sRGB, and that is pretty much it. You can go ahead and do that and then save it as a preset for make your editing process easier in the future. So go ahead and export those. So once our images are exported, we're gonna go ahead and click here to open up Sequator. You're gonna see a few things here on the left. You click on Start, double click on Start Images to import your files. So we'll navigate over here to the folder, select all your files. It's going to automatically select your base image. That's usually fine. I think it picks the middle one, right? Yeah, so it'll pick the middle one. And as I mentioned in part 1 of the Milky Way photography tutorial, the Milky Way will be shifting between these shots, but the program luckily will set the base image and align all the Milky Way shots to this one base image that it selects automatic. If for some reason the base image isn't the one that you want, maybe there's like some light pollution or something, you can go in here, double click and select a different one. But no big deal. Noise images, vignetting images, I don't really mess with. Vignetting images, you would take a blank photo of a white surface and it'll subtract the vignetting for you there. Output, this is where you're gonna set your output folder. I'm just gonna output into the same folder that the other images are located in. And just rename this to Stacked Ruby Beach. Then you have some settings down here. Let's see, we got the composition, align stars, leave that as is. Freeze ground, we'll just select your foreground and keep that in the same place and track the Milky Way as it moved in between your shots and align that to the frozen ground. It's hard to explain, but so you select freeze ground and then you go into sky region over here and select irregular mask. It actually says right here, use brush to indicate the sky region, don't touch the foreground. Suggest to use with freeze ground. So you can click auxiliary highlight as you paint in this area, and everything that is green will be the sky or what it considers the sky. The red is going to be the foreground, which is going to be frozen as we selected earlier. And if you go over a little bit, it's not a big deal. The next few tabs we're going to ignore. Keep that as is, auto. I mean, you could look up what these things do, but I really don't bother with it. Once you've completed all that, you're going to go ahead and just click the start. It'll do the quick processing, probably in about 10 seconds. It'll say completed successfully. You close that. And you can go ahead and close this window because we're not going to be needing this program. And then go back into your folder and you're going to import that stacked image. Take a quick look at this image and compare it to one of these. You can see there's a noticeable reduction in noise because noise is never in the same place at the between shots. So what it does is just cancels out the noise. You can see a little bit in the corners. We get that's just pretty much due to the lens. You get a little bit of blurriness, but sometimes I'll crop in. But if you zoom out, it's really not that noticeable. So anyways, you also notice these shooting stars are taken care of. So this is just the first step in this editing process. I would do the lens correction stuff here before I take it into Photoshop. So just bring up those corners a little bit. Maybe adjust the exposure a tiny bit, but we're going to be doing most of that in Photoshop. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. And the foreground is pretty dark, but like I said, we're going to be bringing in this image. So what we'll do is we'll sync up one of our stacked images with these and then adjust from there. So as we can see, it's a little bit too bright. This one might not even be usable. So we're just going to stick with this one. Make sure the white balance matches. Looks pretty much the same. And there's not going to be any light on this area back here, but you know, that could only be helped with a blue hour shot, which I didn't take. So anyways, we're gonna take our stacked image from Sequator in our foreground image and edit, open as layers in Photoshop, and then we're gonna jump into Photoshop. So we have our images here, and let's first check to see that they are lined up correctly, and it looks pretty good to me looking at the edge over here. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the sky portion of this first. I might be using some of this foreground here since with the stacking we did denoise it quite a bit, and for some of these dark areas it might be useful. We're probably just going to paint in the lighter parts of this area as needed. So I'm going to duplicate this and make a quick selection of the sky, and we don't have any trees except for this area, so it'll be fairly easy to deal with this. Make sure you don't select the water by accident, and when you have a rough selection here, you go to select and mask, maybe zoom in a little bit, and using the refining brush we're going to fix a little bit of these edges over here. Just one pass over with the brush should do it. And this horizon is pretty clean, but just in case, I'm going to go over it with the brush. You also want to make sure that you have Smart Radius selected, and about 3 pixels should do it. You'll see in some areas it goes over too much, and then if you hold Alt, it'll fix that. So we have a good selection here. Additionally, what I like to do is shift the edge about 15% to sort of expand the selected area, feather it half a pixel about, and then you select OK. So now we have just the sky selected. We're going to click the mask, create mask button, and as you can see, we have just the sky selected. So this is going to be overlaid on top of this layer, which is the whole thing. We're just going to use this for the foreground really, and then of course our painted foreground. So we're going to bring this layer into Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Similar layout to Lightroom, but I just recently updated, that's why this thing is popping up. But it's a similar layout to Lightroom, same kind of sliders here, but we're in Photoshop, so we're going to work with this. So what I will usually do first is take my adjustment brushes, and I will first bring back this Milky Way a little bit. So just so I can see what I'm selecting, I'm going to select the temperature way up. You know, I'm going to adjust that later, of course. But I'm going to zoom in here. You unclick this triangle, and then you make sure Auto Mask is selected. That way it'll avoid the stars and any very obvious contrast boundaries here. Make sure we zoom in and have a good view of the Milky Way. We'll start from the bottom, and we're going to start painting in anywhere that's already kind of yellowish. It's usually around the main core area. We have this kind of yellowing. For whatever galactic reason it happens, it's what it looks like. And you don't want to go too far up here because we're only accentuating sort of the colors that are already there. If you get too much of this looking yellow, it's going to look quite obviously retouched. So this core is a little bit less prominent than some of the later ones that we're going to edit. So once we have that painted in, we're going to go into the color tab over here, and I usually add a sort of orangish yellow kind of a tint. So just drag up and down until you have something that's somewhat noticeable but not too obvious. You can click this button to see the effect before and after. That looks pretty good to me. Then we're going to create another brush here, and this time we're going to accentuate this middle dark area of the core. And the settings here, we're just going to drop the exposure so we can see what we're doing, and make sure Auto Mask is on and all that. Go ahead and start painting that in. For some of these smaller areas, you might have to make the brush smaller just to get in there. And go ahead and paint that in. And the same as with the yellowing, we don't want to go all the way up and increase the darkness of the core to the edges because it'll look unnatural. So once we have that selection done, let's zero back this exposure. And I usually start by dropping the shadows so we get only the dark area selected. Even though we have the auto mask on, I like to start with that. And then we'll bring the exposure down a tiny bit. And we'll also create a luminance mask here, just to make sure we're not touching the stars. So just bring that down a little bit. And with the Visualize Luminance Map button here, we can see exactly what it's affecting, everything in red. So let's go back up here and refine that. Something like that, probably. Maybe a tiny bit less. We're going to dehaze this whole layer and add more contrast to it that way. So it's a good starting point. Let's go back here and just a before and after of our entire effect, bringing in some yellow and some contrast to the middle. Next thing we want to do is drop a graduated filter. I do 2 gradient filters on the sky. The first one, let's make sure all our settings are zeroed here. Okay, so the first one is really going to affect the blacks and the dark areas. So with the dehaze tool, we're going to add a little bit of saturation and contrast that way. So something like this. You want to play with that slider a little bit depending on your photo. Then we're also going to create a luminance range mask and make sure that we're not affecting any of the brighter areas. Something like that. The downside here is you accentuate your vignetting a little bit too much with this. That's why we want to do only a slight dehazing on this. And we're going to add a general contrast tone curve on the whole thing. So a little bit of that, and we're also going to reduce a little bit of the noise, which there shouldn't be too much because of the stacking, but just in case. Next we create another graduated filter, pretty much in the same place. And this is really going to treat only the highlights and the stars because we want to make them pop a little bit more. So I usually bring up the whites and just to get a little bit more brightness out of them in case we did anything in the other editing processes to darken them, and then create another range luminance mask over here. And this is just going to be the stars and the core pretty much. A little before and after, see how it's coming along. You can see the contrast that we added is very slight except for this part in the middle here. So just going to do some quick adjustments, not really paying attention to this, but making sure that sky is nice and even. Maybe even bump up exposure a tiny bit because I'm going to be going to the tone curve here and just add a tiny bit more contrast in. You can see that is before, after. We're probably going to add a little bit more contrast once we get back into Lightroom, but this for the sky is a good start. Click OK to finalize all those adjustments. It'll load them into the layer, boom. And now we see our adjustments added here. This is a before and after, a lot more contrasty, as you can see here. And since we made a mask, it's only affecting the sky. So now we got to deal with our foreground here. So I'm going to put my foreground layer up on top, Alt-click the Create Mask tool, go to the brush, set this pretty low because we're going to be doing very light painting here. And you can actually move this just below your sky layer. So if you accidentally go over your foreground into the sky, you won't see any noticeable effect there. So using the Wacom tablet, we're going to go ahead and start painting in the foreground. So we want to start with light strokes because we're not trying to make the foreground too prominent. It's definitely going to be nothing like this, but just to paint in some more detail than what we have here. So that's pretty good. We just want a light foreground paint over here, because obviously our main focus is going to be the Milky Way. So that looks pretty good. And if I think I overdid it, I can always just reduce the opacity. And actually looking at this, you can see that some of the water area is brighter in our main image. So I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this that I painted over the water. But anything that was close to the rocks here, I light painted correctly. So sometimes you have to just double check, and depending on how you compose your shot and the situations, just adjust accordingly. So I'm just going to go in here into the black and remove that area. So that looks pretty good. We have our 3 layers here, and we still have a little bit more work to do on this image. So we're gonna merge that, save, and treat this as if it was a regular image that we had brought into Photoshop, where we would analyze the image and then see what needs to be removed here. What distracting elements, like this log. This one is fine. There's a little bit of one sticking into the shot here. And actually I might crop some of this bottom part out. And I want a little emphasis on the foreground. It's mostly about that Milky Way. So that fixes that problem. A little bit less foreground never hurts anybody. It's looking good right there. And I think we're ready to bring it back into Lightroom for the final adjustments. We're not going to be doing any dodging and burning here because there is not many shadows here that I want to accentuate on the rocks. And the Orton blur is not really part of my workflow for the astrophotography either. I just add clarity to the sky, and that's a similar kind of effect. So let's close that. So let's do a comparison to our final image here. You can see there's a little bit of difference in the crop, in the contrast. Let's see, I cropped even more of this side out. And I believe that was to center the Milky Way. But that's up to personal preference, you know, if you want to line this up on the rule of thirds or leave it like this. From here, let's just do some final adjustments. Make it a little bit more dreamy with the negative clarity. I'm going to add some contrast, so raise the exposure a tiny bit. Go back to our tone curve. I'm going to raise the blacks a tiny bit, just so we retain a little bit more detail. I'm not sure if I'm going to mess with the white or black point. Some people like extremely bright and contrasty Milky Ways, like I mentioned, but personally not my style. We do want to make sure that it's not muddy or faded, so I will bring those whites up a tiny bit, since these photos were sort of dark in the original stack. Do a little before and after. See, we brought back some of the saturation just by adding contrast. I'm going to go ahead and add our sharpening, which helps make the stars pop out a little bit more. See how much that brings them back. And overall, I'd say that's about it for this image. Looks pretty similar. This one looks a little bit more yellow, and actually this one might be a little bit better because it's more saturated. This one looks kind of faded for some reason. I don't know if I didn't add enough dehaze, but I kind of like the color of this one too, a little bit more purple. Moving on to something different, let's see how to put together a pano. So this one we're actually not going to be using the Sequator because these are pano shots, and you can't take, as I mentioned in the first tutorial, you can't take multiple shots of every angle because the Milky Way will move too much in between shots. So this is going to be slightly noisier, but I'll show you how we do our best to make this Milky Way pop and end up with something like this. Some clouds in this image too, but they were barely noticeable in the original. I'll start with something where you see the Milky Way prominently here in the middle. And this one we can actually do the lens profile correction since we're not going to be bringing it into Sequator. I'm going to do the basic adjustments here. As I did previously, I'll just speed right through that. And here we're actually going to do a little bit more noise reduction than we did in the original, in the previous edit, because we're not going to be stacking these. So you can see just bringing this up to about 15 does a pretty decent job. And the A7 III, the camera I took this photo with, combined with that 1.4 Sigma, it really does a good job of not having you have to raise the ISO so much and introducing color noise. There's virtually no color noise here. It's just a little bit of regular grain. And then you'll also notice in this shot, the Milky Way looks gigantic, especially compared to the one that we just edited. And that's because with a wide angle lens, you can get a lot more of the landscape, but the Milky Way looks a lot smaller. With a shot like this, if you want as wide of a shot, you're gonna have to take multiple shots and combine them as a pano, but you will get a larger Milky Way. For example, this is a single shot with that same lens, pretty much that same shot that we were looking at right here. And you can see how much bigger the Milky Way looks. It's a matter of preference and varies from situation to situation. Sometimes you just can't take such a long shot because of what the landscape looks like. But anyways, to finish up here, I think that's a good starting point. Might boost a tiny bit of vibrance here. So we're going to select all our shots, which begin right here. And we're going to sync this to all shots of the pano. And luckily, Lightroom has a built-in pano compiler feature. So you just, once they're all synced up, you right-click, you go to Photo Merge, Panorama, and it's a similar engine to what Photoshop uses, but this will keep it as a raw image in Lightroom. So if you want to continue to make adjustments, or you could bring it into Photoshop for further adjustments, which is what we'll do. There's different settings here, spherical, cylindrical, you can see it's loading that one right now, and perspective. And really depending on the situation and how you actually took your shots will determine which is the best option here. Cylindrical usually works best, but in this situation you can see the perspective is making the Milky Way too small and warped looking. Cylindrical is also kind of warping it. Spherical is closer to what I want. To decide what really works for you, you just kind of have to cycle through them, and using this boundary warp, it'll fill in these gaps that you have in the edges. And if I recall correctly, what I did was I used spherical, which the Milky Way looks a little bit compressed here. I used the boundary warp to fill in the edges, and then when I brought it into Photoshop, I pretty much just stretched the image, because as it is digitally compressing the Milky Way, if we just stretch it out using the free transform feature in Photoshop, it'll pretty much stretch this out into a 3:2 composition and fix this weird looking shrunken Milky Way. So we'll leave that as is and use that as our starting point here. So our panorama gets added to our library here. And as I mentioned, it's looking kind of squashed. The foreground isn't looking too bad, but the Milky Way is looking quite squashed. And as you can see, we can use this image as a guide to what we're trying to achieve. Normally you would look at this and be like, what have I done? Ruin this image. But as I will explain, it's totally recoverable. And if you look at our final image, it's pretty much just stretched upwards, giving the Milky Way back its normal appearance. I'm not going to really touch anything else here. The adjustments kind of stay as they were when you added them to the individual images, so we'll leave that as is. It does look like it got a little bit brighter, so I'm going to bring that down. and kind of even that out. Yeah, it actually got way brighter. Something to do with the boundary warp that does that. Additionally, something you'll notice with the panos is you'll get a lot larger resolution images. This one is 9,000 by 556 megapixels, or pixels. So I don't know what that is as a megapixel sensor, but it definitely increases basically increases the megapixel capability of your camera. This is how panos work with all cameras. And you can zoom in and get a lot more detail out of it, and it'll really make a better print than a single shot. Although a single shot looks fine from distance, you know, you're not really gonna zoom in up close to your framed print on the wall anyways, but it's good to know that you have this capability. So as mentioned, we're gonna go ahead and take this into Photoshop for our finishing adjustments, or our second to last finishing adjustments. So the first thing I'm going to do here is increase the canvas size so that I can stretch the image out. And then we go to Edit, Free Transform, hold Shift when you're clicking on this top one. And you want to stretch the Milky Way out till it looks more normal, but you want to keep in mind that we're also kind of stretching out this. So we don't want to warp the foreground too much. So you gotta find a happy medium. Something like that looks good to me. If you zoom out, kind of give you a different perspective. The Milky Way still looks a little bit too squashed to me. So I'm gonna do something like that. That looks a little bit better. Looks like these corners are warped, if anything. So I'm gonna click enter, and then I'm gonna go here to the warp, transform warp, and just bring up the corner a little bit, because that's sort of what is sagging. And then we'll use content aware to sort of fill in the middle here. That looks pretty good. And we might even be cropping out a lot of this, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Next, we want to get our 3:2 aspect ratio here for our image. So like I said, we're going to be cropping maybe here. We decide whether we want that much foreground. So bring in the sides a tiny bit here. And then we don't have to worry actually about content aware filling any of that. You can fill in this area, but otherwise it's looking pretty good. It's always good to make sure that your horizon is straight, which I don't think it is. So as we're zoomed in here, you'll notice we have some sensor spots here due to the long exposure. So with the spot healing brush, you can go in and just take care of them individually. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm not going to worry about it too much. What we're going to do is duplicate this layer, and just like we did with the previous image, we're going to select the sky so that we're only affecting the sky and we don't darken or do anything too much to the foreground, since we don't have a lot to work with here. So we take the quick selection tool and actually make sure we save in between. So now we have our sky selected. So we're going to make adjustments just to the sky and then to the foreground separately. So with that layer selected, go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Our basic adjustments are, of course, pulling down the clarity a little bit, dehazing to add some saturation and some contrast. And then we're going to take our brush and start painting in, just like we did with the previous shot, paint in some yellows here and some darker contrast in the middle of the core. So now we got our Milky Way painted in. You can see a before and after there. Adds a little bit more color, a little bit more contrast. We're going to drop our gradient filters here on the sky again. And this one, we're going to start with the dark areas, a little bit of dehaze, create a luminance range mask. And a little bit of noise reduction, which we're going to need more than usual since this is a pano. So let's do before and after. That's looking pretty good. We're going to worry about the foreground in a little bit and do some further adjusting in Lightroom, of course. But I'm happy with the way that looks. So as far as the foreground here, we see we have a lot of noise, but there's not a lot of noise in these really dark areas. So what we can do is just select some of these parts here on the ocean and just darken those, and that will reduce some of the noise. We can also, before we do that, let's just run this whole layer through Camera Raw filter and do a noise reduction just on that layer. And zoom in here, and there's a lot of color noise from what it looks like. So we'll go into the Details tab, add some more noise reduction, add some color noise reduction. And that helps a little bit. And of course we lose details, but with the contrast, added contrast is all going to be darkened later. So that's probably a good start there. So we can see it looks a little bit better. I'm going to deal with it a little bit more in Lightroom. Just drop a gradient filter on here with a luminance mask, and that'll take care of that area, those areas over there. Let's see, is anything else I need to do here is probably get rid of these, I believe they're planes flying by, which Sequator would normally get rid of for us, but we have to do it manually. So we're going to merge these layers. So that's looking pretty good. With the final adjustments in Lightroom, we'll make this pop a little bit more and add all the finishing touches and finish it up from there. So going back and forth between our final image, we can see the stretching was a little bit, I did a little bit more stretching in this one. Who knows how the Panorama put it together in the previous one. It's not going to match exactly, but it's more or less the same framing. I think I removed this little rock over here in this one, but not a big deal. Let's first do some basic adjustments here. As I mentioned, we're going to get rid of some of these bright areas so that the noise is less noticeable. We're going to add our tone curve contrast to the whole thing. And that's about it. As you can see, it's looking pretty similar. A nice little 13-shot pano. If I was to add one more thing after the vignette, of course, it would be the sharpening. Just bring back that detail in the stars. And that's it right there. Just do a quick comparison. We got rid of most of the noise here, but you really can't beat something that has been stacked. It's just cleaner in these plain areas. But for Instagram or anything else where people are not going to be zooming in, it looks perfectly all right to me. So this tutorial is taking a little bit longer than expected, so I'm just gonna do one more image and wrap it up, so at least you have an example of a light painted foreground, a pano, and finally we're going to do a blue hour composite right here. The additional one I was going to do was this one at Mount Rainier, but this would actually be the easiest edit of all since there is no light painting foreground. It was fairly bright, and it's pretty much just stacking the image with no masking or compositing involved. So this would probably be the most challenging. This is what we are striving to get over here. Stacked images for the sky, and then this blue hour shot for the foreground. All you have to do is match the white balance, really. So let's get started here. Let's pick any old image here. This was done with the 14mm 2.8, so it's a wide shot. You get the whole secret beach area here. We're not going to do any of the auto settings, but we're going to do a little bit of vignetting reduction. And I'll just speed right through these since we've already covered them. So I've synced my adjustments to all the layers, and if you remember correctly, we go to export and export them as TIFFs so we can work with them in Sequator. Go to my preset over here. It's going to be in that same TIFF folder, and go ahead and export them. Then we'll open up Sequator. Double click here to find our images in the TIFFs folder. Select them. Our base image is right here. I remember seeing one of these images had a little light painted streak on it, so we just have to make sure that one isn't selected. This one right here. Probably somebody shining a flashlight, but looks to be all good. It wasn't selected here. Get our output set to the main folder. We're going to call this Stacked Secret Beach. And then if you remember our settings down here, keep everything the same, freeze ground, then we go into sky region and paint in our sky once again. So we'll go ahead and click start. Then we can close this. And we just have to re-import. And so here is our stacked image. We zoom in nice and close. You can see the reduction in noise compared to one of the originals. Quite noisy. Not noisy at all. And there is our starting point. Next we'll do a few quick little adjustments here to get it ready for Photoshop. Do our profile lens correction, which sometimes the lens doesn't show up here for some reason after being exported. So you can do a little manual distortion just kind of by eye, looking at the horizon. And just make sure you sync that to your blue hour shot so that they match. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and adjust this one. The thing to make sure is you get the right white balance, because at blue hour it can look too blue and it won't match what the landscape looked like at night. And this shot was 25 seconds, so there is a little risk of noise here. But it's going to be darkened anyways afterwards, so that looks pretty good. Make sure you get rid of all the blue. And it's a little bit misaligned because I returned to the spot later, so we'll just have to deal with that in Photoshop. But otherwise, and I think the horizon is off too. So that's looking good. I'm going to grab both these images, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. So as always, we're going to start by selecting the sky here. So our edits are only made to the sky. Click Create Mask, and now we have a mask of just our sky layer. We'll ignore this blue hour layer for now. And I actually forgot to duplicate it, so I'm going to duplicate one and then delete the layer mask on that. So we have one original and one just the sky. So we're going to take our sky layer, go into Camera Raw Filter, and do all those basic edits that I have gone over the last 3 photos. So I'll speed through that real quick. Okay, so we have our sky layer edited. What I'm going to do now is just merge this and our foreground layer, just so we don't have so many layers lying around. And then the tricky part is lining up this blue hour layer. So there are different ways of doing this. I don't think the auto align feature is going to serve us too well, because there's a huge difference in what at least the sky looks like, and it's not smart enough to identify the foreground, the similar shaped rocks. So I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to lower the opacity and somewhat drag it in the right position. And you want to start by aligning the center, and then you can go to the free transform, hold shift, and then adjust the edges, because sometimes you're just at a slightly different perspective. Ideally, you want to be in exactly the same place, but if you're shooting throughout the night, it's not always possible. So if you do what I did and just shoot the blue hour later, you're going to have to make small adjustments like this. And once you got it somewhat there, you should only really have to worry about what is here on the horizon, because anything down here is either going to be cropped out or it's going to be the blue hour shot. There's not going to be any overlay. Only thing that worries me are these features. The trees are slightly different, and it seems to be a little bit of a distortion issue. Maybe, like I said, I'm not in the exact same place. So what you can do is just raise your blue hour shot till the main areas are overlapping that bottom layer, which means you're going to lose some of the sky here, but that's not a big deal. And also make sure that your horizon is level. And the way to deal with some of these trees, because the rocks are going to be covered by your top layer here, the way to deal with these trees, there's a few ways of doing it, but the way I like to just keep it simple is content aware fill them out. And like I said, this is only a fix if you didn't take a blue hour shot in exactly the same place. Ideally, you want to stay in the same place either until sunrise or arrive at sunset and stay until astro and get that shot in exactly the same place, but it's not always possible, especially if you want to run around and get other shots like I did. So just a little bit more work in post. That seems to be aligned well enough. Next thing what we're going to do is mask out this whole sky area with the quick selection brush. So do a rough selection there, and then go into select and mask and refine the selection. Then you create a mask based on that selection, and we pretty much have our foreground here. What I'm going to do is paint in a little bit more and make the blend here a little bit better. so it's not that harsh of a cut. You can see like a little bit of haloing, and some part of the mask here isn't exactly perfect, so I'm going to fix that first. So that's pretty good. What you'll notice, of course, is this is way too bright to be the foreground for this shot. So we'll go in here and create an adjustment layer and make sure you have this little box ticked. And we're going to darken that way down to make it more believable. And we'll leave that there. Another thing that will help is if you go to adjustments and you desaturate a little bit, because at night you don't see a lot of color. So it wouldn't make sense that it is that blue. So additionally, I'm going to make the crop. I'm not sure if I'm going to do an Instagram crop because that might be too tight. But I'm going to do a little bit tighter than what it is right now. Definitely lose a lot of this down here that is not really contributing. Maybe right at that line where the water hits. Keep it simple. We don't need too much in the foreground. And then lastly, let's go ahead and decide if we're okay with this here. It's a little bit hazy on the horizon. Some clarity, negative clarity in Lightroom will fix that. But let's go ahead and merge those layers. And lastly, what we'll do to further sell this composite is create a fake reflection by creating a copy of the sky, inverting it, about there. Then we mask that out, and we go in and we're going to quick select everywhere where we see sort of a reflection of the sky here. And then we go back up into our duplicated sky layer, and we're going to paint in just a little bit of the reflected Milky Way. If you look at our shot here, just that little bit of reflection sells it a lot better. But then what you notice is the stars are too sharp and definitely not realistic. So we go to blur, Gaussian blur, and we just blur them out a tiny bit. Mainly so we get the colors down here. We don't specifically want these stars to be visible. It's okay if some of the brighter ones are, but we mainly want a little bit of the Milky Way colors reflected in the water here. Makes a little bit of a difference. So that is about it for the Photoshop edits. We're going to take this into Lightroom and finish it up. So if we see what we're striving for here, a lot more contrasty. I think I might have added more contrast to the sky because we still have the detail in the foreground, but let's see how close we can get. So I'd say we're pretty close here. We were able to bring back some of the color. This one seems to be a little bit more blue. This one is a little bit softer and a little bit more yellow. But I do like this horizon. I could have done a little bit cleaner, but I still kind of like it better than this one. This one is too much of a straight composite there. And if you really zoom in, if you pixel peep, you will notice that. This one could have been just a hazy horizon. Pretty normal, it happens. So there you have it. You have our 3 images, 3 different astrophotography methods. We have our light painted shot, we have our pano shot, and we have our Blue Hour composite shot. That'll give you a good range of what you can accomplish and how to refine your astrophotography editing style. So there you have it, 3 different techniques for editing your astrophotography Milky Way photos. We covered light painting composites, we covered Blue Hour composites, we covered panos, merging panoramas, and your editing style will probably change. It'll differ from mine. Whatever style you lean more towards, the contrasty style Milky Ways or the softer negative clarity style Milky Ways that I prefer, whether blue tones or purple tones. You'll have your own personal style, and it'll change over time. So I hope you learned something from this tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to check out my other photography tutorials, location guides, other travel content on my channel. Like and subscribe for more, and I will see you on the next one.